Okay. The side of proposition recognizes the benefits of globalization. Now, we do not claim that globalization is perfect. We do not claim that it doesn't have any harms. What we do regret is the way these anti-globalist movements handle those harms. The way they try to solve problems in an inefficient way. Now, first of all, what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to talk about what types of movements do we have, what two types of movements of anti-globalization exist, and after that we're going to talk about our two substantial points. First, about how these anti-global movements are populistic, and second, about economy. Our third substantive point will be talked about in our second argument. Okay, so what we see today is that there are two types of anti-globalistic movements. One type are the ones that are maybe a little more conservative, a little more right-wing. They are the ones who are a bit more popular, more actually successful. Why? Because they actually managed to meddle into politics. These are the examples of Front National and Trump in the USA. No, thank you. The second type of anti-global movements are the ones who do not actually meddle into politics. They're more left-wing movements, even though we have Syriza as an example, but we'll talk about that later. They're more left-wing movements that actually have no political power and are inefficient in a different way. Okay, let's talk about our first substantive point. So the reason why we regret anti-globalistic movements is because they are populistic. Now let's talk about globalization. So first of all, we have two types, as we already said. We have right-wing activists and we have left-wing activists. In the right-wing activists, how do they actually handle this scenario? We have globalization. Globalization has its benefits, as we already said. For example, freedom of movement. We have benefits to be able to go wherever we want and get employed there. Now, what the harms that this freedom of movement brings? Sometimes, in some countries, will lower the work wage. How do the anti-globalistic movements handle this? Nationalism. What does that mean? They portray this problem as if this is the problem because these immigrants shouldn't be in our country and lower our wages. No, thank you. Now, notice also that how actually right-wing anti-globalistic movements pinpoint these problems and decide to only focus on them, over-exaggerating them. Now, why is this a problem? Because then because they do not have any sufficient answer to this problem, they just want to focus on it. Okay, no thank you. Why does this narrative even get people going in the first place when it comes to nationalism? It's because people are very keen to believe that they are a part of something bigger, such as national identity, and the idea that our history brings us together more than some immigrant from Mexico, for example. And this is why we have Trump, who says the reason why there's unemployment is because Mexicans are taking our jobs. Now, why is this problematic? It's because these people are not guilty of trying to make a better living. But what we do is that voters buy into these emotions of strong patriotism, strong nationalism, and make wrong decisions on the elections. These are people whose policies affect your everyday education, everyday lives, which means education and healthcare. Okay. No, thank you. The reason why these are not efficient policies is because the real issues do not have any, because they do not have any real ideas of how to do this. They only have the nationalist facade that they are trying to get the votes from the people.
On that point,
okay.
Note that these people leave their countries because MNCs are extorting and dominating their markets.
Okay, we're going to talk about it in our third argument, but thank you. So what the problem is that, okay, so we have leftists. So now let's talk about the leftist movements. Leftist anti-globalist movements have a completely different problem because they're not as sufficient. What they do is they focus themselves on this ideal world. They focus themselves on having fiscal equality or eco-friendly world and stuff like that. Why is this a problem? It's because they only focus on their idea of this ideal world, but not on the limitations of the real world, not on the restrictions and on the mechanisms how they will fix this. How does this? What happens then? We have eco-terrorism, which is not really sufficient because they have no mechanisms how to solve, how to get to the eco-friendly world they want. So in the context of this argument, for example, because we're talking about populism, we have Syriza, no thank you, which is a heavily left-wing party, anti-globalist party in Greece. Now, what they did is they had this idealistic way of how they're going to solve the problem with Greece's debt, but they didn't manage to do that. What they managed to do is just kill the whole economy, and the EU at the end had to help them not go to the crippling. To cripple the economy completely. Okay, so across the spectrum, we see that populist parties are not efficient when they rise to power. What they do is they just pinpoint a problem without actually being able to solve them, without actually talking about other problems. And in the best case scenario, we have an unsustainable, illusional solution, and in the worst case scenario, we are bringing direct harms to the problem they're trying to solve. For example, Trump trying to build a wall, or Syriza killing the whole economy because they were trying because they were trying to help Greece. Okay, let's talk about our second standard point. This is economy. Now, we already told you why these parties are populistic and how this affects usually. How this affects the whole country. But let's talk about why is this important. Because when we actually have this anti-globalistic movement, they're isolation. Okay, they have policies of isolation. And what does this mean? They focus on their own local trade. Why is this a problem? Because in order to focus on your own local trade, you have to cut trade with other countries. You have to, therefore, because you have your own economic policies, you have to exit some economic communities, and then you raise tariffs. Why do you raise tariffs? It's because you want to export more than you import, and then this in order to make money. But why is this a problem? It's because because the reason why trade between countries is important is because no actual economy of a country is sustainable. We can't exist without the trade between the countries. So why is this isolation necessarily bad? So they won't actually. So we don't have to answer that later. Is because we need political capital. How does this happen? For example, we have China, we have Belt and Road Initiative, we have USA. USA decides that they want to have the policies of isolationism. Now what happens is that then they don't have any more political capital over the Asian countries they used to have because they do not want to trade with them anymore. So China creates the Belt and Road Initiative and takes the political capital. So what does USA lose? They lose the political capital, they lose bargaining power, and they lose the relations between countries. Now, worst case scenario, what happens is that then we have trade wars. How do we have trade wars? Because we are raising tariffs between China and USA are raising tariffs between each other, and no one actually no investors know which country will win the war. For example, China's whole investment. The number of the money that people invest in China has drastically fallen. From 2016, when there was $46 billion going to China, now in 2018 it's only $4.8 billion. So as we already told you, these are the direct consequences of what the anti-globalistic movements do, the economic politics that they actually try to implement. So please vote proposition.
Panel, an essential component to preserve the functioning of a competent democratic entity, and something that we need to provide a good debate to you today is an opposition, and we are very proud to provide these on both of the layers. 3 things in my speech. First, reactions to their stance. Second, rebuttal. Third, our first argument on how we send a powerful signaling effect. And James will be talking about the impacts on workers globally and how they create global crises. One thing to their contextualization. Anti-global movements are not just political parties left and right. They are very often influential intellectuals such as Mr. Solvers or Mr. Roderick, which are very often in powerful positions and are advisors of governments and have, therefore, power. And moreover, it is also third world initiative or environmental movements such as Greenpeace. Now to their first argument, 5 reactions. First, nationalism is not something that is inherent to anti-global movements, right? And this is a regret motion. Therefore, a world without anti-global movements can still exist as a world with nationalism. It will just be nationalist globalists, which means that they will want to get more benefits for their country, but not necessarily go against the concept of globalization. Second, we say that refugees are coming into West exactly because of globalization. James mentioned this in the point of how MNCs are exploiting the resources and the labor in developing countries, which forces the people out of it because their opportunities are lower. It is international organizations such as NATO invading Iraq, displacing millions of people. These are the harms caused by globalization. They create the problem. Thirdly, we say it is justified to strengthen the borders of your own state and to support your own people based off of the social contract. And you're the most competent leader insofar as when you support the people in your own state. Fourthly, when they say that eco-terrorism does nothing but harms, right? No. The Greenpeace, which is an anti-global movement, as they, for example, advocate the boycotting of Shell because it creates oil spills in Nigeria, has prevented the testing of hydrogen bombs in the 70s because they had violent protests. We believe that these environmental movements provide great benefits. And lastly, fifthly, when they say that Syriza, destroyed the economy of Greece, no. The economy of Greece was destroyed because it was integrated into a globalized organization as the European Union, and it adopted their common currency. And it is a well-known fact that asymmetric shocks destroy the smaller countries in unions with a common currency. It is not because of a leftist party having good intentions. To their second argument, two reactions. A, the Belt and Road Initiative is a globalist movement. That is to say, China is one of the main proponents of globalization, and it is exactly because countries in Africa and in Asia do not have strong enough borders that China is able to exploit them. But secondly, initiating a trade war is fine insofar as when you're trying to mitigate the trade deficit that your country is currently burdened with. Now, to my own argument on why we provide a powerful signaling effect, but before that, I take a point. No point. Okay, so the first thing we must acknowledge, feel free to give me throughout the argument. The first thing we must acknowledge is that anti-global movements threaten the establishment, and they do so through two mechanisms. Firstly, the point at which an anti-global movement is voted in is a point when the seats and the power of the established neoliberal elites are eroded because there is a scarce amount of them, right? But secondly, anti-global movements are very often anti-establishment in rhetoric, as they themselves have said. This means that the point at which they are voted in is a point when they are trying to undermine the policies and the measures that these established groups do, or straight up trying to just oust them. This means that the established neoliberal elite, in a second, is threatened under our side, and this brings many benefits. But before that, I'll take a point.
All the harms that you have said, we completely concede with that, but how do you change it on your side, since we can see that anti-globalist movements haven't done anything in the last of their existence?
And the fact, look, we are living right now in a world with anti-globalization movements, right? A world where we say that we have borders that are a lot stronger than in a world where there would be no movements as such. We say that in that world, the BRI would be a lot more exploitative and MNCs would have a lot larger power, but I'll get to more mechanisms when I finish this argument. So, how are anti-global movements created? They stem from an anti-globalization sentiment. That is to say, Brexit did not pop out of nowhere. It was a cumulative process of an accumulation of anger among the common Brexit people that have been for far too long unheard. The yellow vests popped out because Macron was a neoliberal elitist and an ex-investment banker that did not care about the needs of the common people, and people in Bangladesh are protesting because they for far too long have been exploited by the MNCs. Now, what this means is that you have an anti-globalization specter along the world haunting the common elite. Because maybe this anti-globalization sentiment per se cannot be defined as an anti-global movement, but it is something that, precedes it, something that will then something out of which a movement will be created. We say that this specter along the world is same in the way how Trump supporters have looked 5 to 10 years ago before they were actually mobilized into a movement, right? And the fact that this sentiment exists creates a threat to the establishment, and they have to deal with this threat, otherwise they will be ousted. And we say that they have to deal with this threat by tackling it at its core. That is, they will try to compensate the people that have been harmed by globalization. We can see this happening today as Western countries are regulating MNCs or fining big tech companies that have been exploiting their powers because globalization has enabled them to do so. We see Macron trying to improve the lives of the common French people because he is threatened by the Yellow Vest movement. But this is very much more important because it is an incentive that we provide that will work in the future. Because the neoliberal establishment right now has to compensate the people that are disenfranchised because they do not want more anti-global movements arising in the future. Therefore, the people that have been left behind will be benefited even more. The fact that we give redress to the people that have been left behind has a structurally uncomparatively higher value than the benefits that they claim or accrued by globalization. We believe that the common people all around the world have been singing the false song of globalization for far too long, and it is time to give them the redress that they need. We are so proud to oppose.
When we have problems such as ozone holes that has been brought by the side of the globalization, when the side of the opposition is trying to tell us that anti-globalist movements that are currently throwing flour on Kim Kardashian to show us that ecology is going to shit, are trying to tell us that and trying to tell us that they're actually solving a problem on their side, where we can see that the things are never being solved by the anti-globalist movements that we actually regret on our side. We are so proud to propose. A few things I will do today in my speech. First of all, we will talk about what the side of the proposition is actually talking about, what is our burden that the side of the opposition try to smartly tackle us. Second of all, we will talk about our first argument about how these movements are actually populistic, not doing much for people. Third of all, we will talk about the economy. Our second argument that they have never rebutted, let me remind you, dear panel, and then we will talk about their first argument, how we are giving the people what they want, and we will move on to our third argument, how the rise of the anti-global movements make all other correlated movements inefficient. So let's start with the beginning. What we are telling you, the burden of the side of proposition is not to show that there would be no anti-global movements at all. We are regretting the rise of the anti-globalist movements that are currently represented in the 21st century. We are telling you that the side of opposition had a really good had a really good chance to actually develop these movements in a way to help us. On our side of the proposition, we agree that we have some problems with globalization. We completely agree that these things have to be solved. But we are telling you that what we are doing as a side of pro, we don't have to show that, first of all, we have an alternative because this is a regret motion. Second of all, we don't have to show that globalization is perfect. What we are showing you is that we are regretting the rise of the anti-globalist movements as they are today, because they are not solving the problems, even perpetuating them more. This is why the side of the proposition is already ruining the debate. So let's see how this actually, what is actually happening with our arguments. So first of all, in our first argument, we are telling you that these parties are mostly populistic. They see a problem in the status quo, and they pinpoint that one single problem and offer no real mechanisms. They offer simplified solutions that can't deal with the structural problems that we actually have in those problems to solve them, and are not solving anything. We have told you, first of all, we have told you that we have the right-wing and the left-wing policies. We have told you that the right-wing policies are the ones who are currently getting represented in the parliament, because they are the ones getting big and are more popular. Second of all, we have the left-wing that are currently not really getting that much big, and we also showed you that in some cases really they are like CSA. So what do they have to say on this argument? First of all, they say that if we actually regard to this motion, that we would only have like some nationalist global movements, never explaining. We are telling you why this is a regret motion, what is the burden of proof of the side of prop, so that attack completely falls to water. Second of all, what they're telling us is that the whole point about exploitation of the developing countries and the Greenpeace things. Two responses that we have to this. First of all, in the developing countries, we are telling that globalization is actually a good thing. We are telling that in developing countries, even though the
Even though the workers aren't treated the best, even though they are not in the best position, this is still better than nothing. Because those people, they wouldn't have anything to do. It will be much better for them to have at least some money than no money. This is the first response. Second response is, yes, we know that this is problematic. We're telling you it's not a nice thing that they work for peanuts. But what we're telling you is that this problem cannot simply be solved how the side of the opposition is trying to solve it. We are telling you that the problem is currently in those countries that the leaders of those countries are letting the exploitation happen. So it's a problem that is engraved in those countries. We should change the country's legacy, not boycott Nike. What happened with the boycotting of Nike? Are you seriously the side of opposition trying to tell me that boycott of Nike actually changed something? People started to not buy Nike shoes for 1 week until another ones came. Nothing happened. We can still see Nike exploiting people. Nothing changes on their side. Their panel, don't ever forget that. Now, there are also one of their things that they told us is by the social contract, these parties should do that. Never explained how, never explained why. Okay, so now on to our second argument about economy, never explained by the side of the proposition. So first of all, let me remind you, now in the first argument we have told you how these are real problems that have to be solved. But the side of the opposition, anti-globalist movements are pinpointing it wrongly, trying to solve it simplifiedly and not doing anything at all. Now when we move on to our second question, in our second argument we are showing you that when we focus on, when we close our borders, the thing that is actually happening now are trade wars and economies falling. So your own citizens are going to suffer because your own products are going to be more expensive. Your economy is not going to be good and your citizens won't live prosperously. The only thing that they are telling us is that the Belt and Road China is a globalization movement. Good morning, side of opposition, this is what we are telling you. The globalization movement of China that is how they work, and we have to have USA opposing them on the other side, so we wouldn't have China raping all the small countries in Africa and Asia like we are telling you. Now on to their first argument, how we are threatening the people. But
You like to talk about, developing countries having to change their governance in order to fight these MNCs. This is exactly what the protests after the fall of Rajapaksa have been trying to do to Bangladesh, which have been anti-global movements.
Okay, thank you. What we can say is that nothing changed. You're bringing us some kind of an example. We can see that we still have Nike boycott, that we have, after boycott of Nike, the kids are still working, the people don't have any better wages, and nothing is changing. Their panel, they have to show us an example where something actually changed, which we cannot see on their side. Then the next things that they have told us, like Brexit, etc., how these things have to be done because people want it. First of all, we're telling you the only thing that these sides of the anti-globalist movements do is they pinpoint all the problems to the minorities. This is why Brexit happens. We're hurting a very large group of people, the minorities that are living in these countries, that are blamed for things that are not theirs. Because the populists are the only way that they can get votes for doing this, and this is the only way that they will get attraction by pinpointing it to something that is touchable to people that are voting for that. Second of all, what we're telling you with the example of Brexit, just because something is just because people can vote on that matter, doesn't mean it's a legitimate vote. We're telling you with Brexit, what happened is that the money of Britain actually has fallen. Like their value of their money has fallen. Their economy is currently really bad. Nobody wants to invest in them because they're closing their borders, because they're unstable, and because they're in trade wars with the European Union that they're currently rebelling against. This is all the problems that we have shown you. So first of all, in my rebuttal, I have shown you that these anti-globalist movements are populistic and that they're not solving the problems efficiently because they're simplifying the problems. Second of all, what we're telling you is in the economy. They pinpoint the problem and generalize it and go against the globalization as a whole and ruin their economy. Now moving on to our third argument, how the rise of anti-global movements makes all other correlated movements actually inefficient. So what we're telling you is that the globalization has some of its downsides that we have to solve. So it has through the globalization, some things evolve. Like we can see that some things next to the globalization evolve, like eco-terrorism, we can see anti-sweatshops, all those movements that should fight specific things, because the globalization movement is in general. The anti-globalization movement as a whole is fighting in general, so we have these specific things that should fight specific problems to solve them efficiently. So these are some movements that have great ideas, but their great ideas are not coming across. Why? Because the anti-globalist movements has gained power, it is popular, and all of those movements actually took up the mechanisms of the anti-globalistic movements, the mechanisms that are inefficient. We can see in eco-terrorism, the side of the opposition that is claiming all those examples, what the eco-terrorism is actually doing is burning the factories that are then exploding and creating even more economic, ecological hazardous things. We can see that they're throwing flour on Kim Kardashian to show that the economy is not good. How can that actually help the side of the opposition? How is that actually changing the burning problems that we have? Because the side of the opposition is currently pinpointing the wrong problems of globalization, solving them inefficiently, and actually making the good things of globalization even worse. That is why we are so proud to regret the motion.
Republic today, we want to harness capitalist competition for innovation, not extortion that Team Croatia is proposing today. Two major strategical inconsistencies on their side of the house. What they say is, we concede to all the harms of globalization, but at the same time, they don't bring any solution. So I'm kind of confused as to why they want to stay with a system where they don't show us on a comparative why the benefits outweigh the costs. That's what I'm going to be doing in my speech. Second, their whole argument on populism essentially is, with immigrants, people get mad at the immigrants and that's bad. Well, logically, if you don't have anti-global movements, you will have more immigrants, and therefore the nationalism that is ingrained in those societies will still breed, and there will be far more with more immigrants. Therefore, if there is any nationalism present in this debate, it's more on their side. But let me first have a look at their argument on isolationism. We say, sure, we are isolationist, but if I compare this, what I'll be doing is I'll be comparing this to the value of inequality that they create and show you why this doesn't outweigh anything. First, what we must realize is that global capitalism tries to accumulate as much profit as possible. It does this because of two mechanisms. First, because of capitalist competition. This is significant because in order for a capitalist to be successful, he must be the one with the most profit or the largest financial capabilities. Second, we tell you very often there is an inherent sense of greed towards these individuals. That is to say, they still indulge in unscrupulous lobbying, no thank you, although they already do have a comfortable financial position. We tell you this is problematic because then they cut short-term costs, and second of all, they lead to monopolization. Now, what does this mean for developing countries? First, we tell you there is a mass amount of exploitation. No thank you, madam. Why? We tell you there is a huge amount of drastic labor conditions because they're simply cutting wages or cutting the costs for their facilities. This looks like 16% of Bangladeshi workers having zero contract hours where they work for over 16 hours a day for minimal compensation. This looks like individuals not being able to purchase proper things for their families and have their basic needs because they work for absolute peanuts. Note that this is caused by globalization because of the sheer fact that there are no trade barriers, so it's easy for these MNCs to penetrate those markets in the very first place, right? We tell you this is inherently wrong because what this ultimately does is it destroys the middle class in this society. This is problematic because very often when you have 783 million people in Southeast Asia in extreme poverty, what happens is these capitalists, when they have accumulated a huge amount of profit, they usually invest into middle-class businesses. At the point at which when you don't have a middle-class business, they start investing into volatile industries that are high profit, incredibly high risk. No thank you, madam. This is incredibly problematic because not only do they have massive fluctuations, but when you have massive MNCs by over $400 million in Filipino stocks that are overappreciating, they have a far larger probability of creating bubbles. So what we're telling you here is even if we are isolationists, we don't take this risk. No, thank you. But how do we solve these issues of having MNCs? Two mechanisms under the veil of internal pressure. First, we tell you very often they are grassroots movements. That is to say, it is led by individuals who live in these harrowing or abhorrent conditions who understand this best. Let's illustrate this on how this worked in Bangladesh, where in 2016, we had massive protests of hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating against sweatshops. Once they were suppressed in 2019, they resurfaced again. What we're telling you here is at the point at which when you have hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating in your capital, irrespective of if you are a democracy or not, you fear this. Therefore, you have, as a politician, a structural incentive to change the issue which people are rioting about. What we saw in Bangladesh was essentially we had a substantial raise in the minimum wage in these sweatshops. This brings you the palpable change that we're asking for, right? Therefore, what this shows is because when we apply pressure through grassroots movements, we get change. No, thank you. Second, we tell you we do this through political parties. That is to say, very often globalist movements aren't on the false dichotomy they want you to tell either left or right. We have a political spectrum that ranges from the left to right. And at the point at which, when we have people coming from these sweatshops who have been to some sort of degree educated, or at least want to enter that political system, which is the example of Nigeria, with the second largest party now, the PPD, where they're propagating for higher costs for land for MNCs in order for them to preclude land grabbing, or to have higher minimum wages, or to employ things like protectionism. At the point at which, when individuals who have lived in these sweatshops understand the conditions, we tell you they have a far greater probability they will vote for these political parties. This is significant because when you have a huge amount of the population who are oppressed in this way, it is a large amount of the electorate they will vote for. No thank you. So even if we do take out an international market, which they wanted to talk about, we tell you this is good, being my second point of rebuttal here. What we're telling you is before we had this international market, right, we had a national market. What this means is there was the same amount of demand, right? At the point in which when you have the same amount of demand, you can expect a very similar amount of supply, right? What this means is the only reason why MNCs are so dominant now is because of massive legal teams, because there are massive financial capabilities that can crowd out these locals. Yes?
We can see that the anti-globalist movements, even if we say they're effective in one place, because of the presumption that they don't want globalism, they won't even start to function globally and unite with others so they can solve the structural problems.
I'll talk about that in my fair point. Cool. So what essentially then happens is if you have the same amount of demand, logically you have a very similar amount of supply. So at the point in which when people are incentivized to also start their own entrepreneurial pursuits, we tell you that they can satisfy this demand and therefore create a strong national economy. Secondly, we tell you very often locals have a far greater sense of corporate social responsibility, right? Because they understand those individuals and which conditions they are, because they can simply associate that. Third point of rebuttal, quickly having a look, thank you, at what happens for populism. So, very simply, populism is incredibly non-contentious material because populism will happen on any side of the house, right? You have globalist populist movements like Bolsonaro, who has massive, incredibly fearful rhetoric where he tries to engender fear among his citizens in order for them to vote for globalist policies, right? So what we're telling you here is this is non-contested material and will happen on any side of the house. But even if we don't think that populism is a bad thing in general, right? We tell you very often populism is just a reaction towards a massive societal issue that actually needs change. So at the point in which, when traditional forms of politics have not solved anything, we tell you there is a necessity to indulge in maybe less unscrupulous tactics, but those that are more effective. So at the point at which, when we have 783 million people in extreme poverty in Southeast Asia, we tell you populism is a proportional way to act. Therefore, even if we are isolationist, I showed you in my split argument at the very beginning that we're capable of facilitating for better conditions for these individuals by providing internal pressure towards these governments, irrespective of their democratic status. I showed you that these companies then have a structural incentive to start investing into long-term issues rather than short-term costs because they simply have to accumulate profit in a different way. So what we're doing on Team Czech Republic today is we're harnessing capitalist competition for innovation, not extortion.
Dear panel, dear audience, when you have the movement that are not only inefficient in solving problems, that are not only perpetuating the same problems they're trying to solve, but moreover jeopardizing all the benefits of globalization that actually exist, which both sides of the house have to agree with. This is not something that we should be proud of. This is not something that we should be happy about. This is something that we should regret. This is the team line from the team proposition, and this is why I'm so incredibly honored to propose this motion. I'll have few areas of clash regarding this debate, right? First of all, we are going to very briefly talk about the burden and why the burden that was put upon us from the Team Czech is not the actual burden on our side of the house. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about the developing world. Thirdly, I'm going to be talking about the populism. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about all the benefits of the globalization that are being jeopardized by these movements, about the economy, which is a very important substantive point from our side of the house, which Team Opposition never
never actually engage with. Let me remind you, dear panel. Okay, first of all, let's just get about the burden of proof on our side of the house. So what the second op tells you is, okay, just because we are acknowledging the problems of globalization and the fact that it's not perfect, we are some kind of obligated to offer some sort of alternative to solve these problems. Like, first of all, we are not regretting the existence of the anti-globalistic movements per se. We are talking about the rise of anti-globalistic movements and how they're becoming so drastic. Like the USA leaving all of the contracts, like everyone putting the focusing only on the national on their national trade instead of the international, etc., etc. That's the first thing we have to talk about. Secondly, the only thing that we have to prove to you, because this is a regret motion, is that all the harms that have been happening because of the rise of anti-globalization movements are outweighing all the benefits that team opposition is trying to prove to you. Like, that's our burden that we have fulfilled. Now I'm going to show you why. Okay, first of all, let's just talk about the developing world. We give you two ultimate responses. No, thank you. We give you two responses. The first response is that the developing world is not actually anti-globalistic. Like, the developing world actually loves globalization. They're supporters of it. Why? Because it provided them with infrastructure. Like when Zara comes and gives factory and creates factory in some country in the developing world, they have to, for example, create the road between the harbor and between the factory, thus creating the infrastructure to this country that would never actually, no thank you, exist before. Secondly, we are literally creating jobs there that have never existed before, thus literally creating the source of income to the people that never actually had the food on their table, and that's how we are actually minimizing the harm on their side of the house. But moreover, we gave you second response. No, thank you. We gave you the second response, taking team opposition on their highest ground and showing to you that even if we admit that situation really is far from perfect in these developing countries, we can still say that they're inefficient in solving this. Why? Because the way these anti-globalistic movements are tackling these problems is that they're not going to the core issue, right? They're boycotting Zara, they're boycotting Nike, they're boycotting no thank you. All of these companies that are exploiting people in the sweatshops, instead of going to the root of the problem, which are the politicians in these developing countries who have created these laws that are not protecting human rights of their workers. Like, they are not going to the root problem. They're just trying to they're just creating the smoke screen, boycotting Nike, thinking something is going to happen. We actually have these anti-sweatshop movements. There was a boycott of Nike, and they were because of the problem of using sweatshops, and nothing really happened. Their stocks are not falling. Everything is fine. All of us are still wearing Nike and timekeeping on our Apple on our iPhones. So literally nothing is happening on their side of the house. And also the response that we also gave you is that when we are talking about direct influence to the politics, when we are talking about human rights of the workers in sweatshop, first of all, what we have to acknowledge is the fact that the anti-globalistic movements that are fighting for the rights of people are leftists, right? And they're not really present into the politics. The anti-globalistic movements that are present in politics are usually right, and they're not going to fight for them. And also again the problem of the entire anti-globalistic movement, they provided with an example of Bangladesh, which we believe is an isolated example. The point of these anti-globalistic movements is that they're actually very contradicting with themselves, right? In order for them to have a mass, in order for them to function, they need networking, they need everyone working together. No, thank you. And they need practically all of the benefits of the globalization that we have today. And they're actually what they're doing is just pinning one single problem to the globalization per se and trying to jeopardize it. Secondly, let's talk about the populism. No, thank you. The only thing they're saying, okay, but populism is not inherent. Populism is not inherent to the process of globalization. But what we tell you is that, okay, you can still have populist politicians. There are not anti-globalization. We are not talking about them in this debate. But what we tell you is that all of the anti-globalistic politicians are inherently populist. Why? Because they're picking out a single problem and offering a very simplified solution to the big problem. And now I'm right now referring to this idea of the economy, which, mind you, again, team opposition has never tackled, which are all the benefits of the globalization we are getting, and they're not talking about why are we jeopardizing them. No, thank you. what we are telling, okay, let's just put an example, right? Like, let's just take the example of Trump. Like, Trump had a slogan, "Make America Great Again," and he was talking about economy, right? Like, he was talking about how immediately when I'm going to be the president, I'm going to amass the wealth. I'm going to amass the wealth of our country, and because he was a populist, he had to offer a very simplified solution to the very big problem. What happened then is he has been removing America. No, thank you. He has been removing America from all the contracts. He has removed America from Trans-Pacific Partnership, which 90% of the economists in USA told him not to do. What happened immediately after he was like putting tariffs up again, he amassed the wealth because there was still like the trade in his country and that had to like pay his tariffs, right? And what we tell you is that this was only short term because once they know that they have to like pay all of these big tariffs, they're not going to be investing into the Trump again. They're not going to be investing into the USA again. We have seen the problem of the plummeting dollar in the economy of the USA, which is very bad. And moreover, let's talk about the example of Brexit, which they don't actually like. They don't actually really tackle. Like we told you, okay, Brexit offered a simple solution. Like they said, okay, because of networking with EU, we are providing too much for them, not getting enough much. And they offered simple solution, just Brexit. Like let's just quit EU. Let's just do something that is like anti-globalistic. What happened then? The plummeting pound. Like no one is trying to invest in the pound, which is like unstable stock, right? And what happened then is that people's life standards were highly decreased in the UK. Like they don't have enough medicines for them. They don't have. They're waiting too much for the import to happen, etc., etc. These are all the harms of these anti-globalization movements that are happening because of this rise of anti-globalization movements. So, dear panel, dear audience, why are you going to vote for team government in this debate? Because we have shown to you that these movements are pinning the problem without actually solving it, and not only that, but they're perpetuating the existing problem. Not only that, they're jeopardizing all of the benefits of globalization we have, and team opposition never tackles that. Team government wins this debate.
Firstly, we've heard from side of proposition that they really want a world with no anti-globalist movements. That was their narrative from the first speech. Then in their third, they come and say that we want less drastic movements. Without no explanation whatsoever, what does that mean? How their world look like? How their world is imaginable? What they told us is that they know that globalization has some problems, and they acknowledge those problems, but they fail to provide us with a description of their world, of how in their world we are helping those workers who would be being exploited. In their world, we would have MNCs who would not have those regulations we have right now thanks to anti-globalism. Ladies and gentlemen, because they failed to fulfill their burden in terms of describing their world and describing why their world is more beneficial for workers and for other stakeholders we had in today's debate. Second problematic here in terms of burdens was the idea that firstly they say that our anti-globalist movements basically create nothing, that nothing is happening. But at the same time they're saying that globalization is somehow being destroyed, and we don't see here like this clear line. Like if you want to say that they're not influential at the same time that they are, there is a clear contradiction on their side of the house. We believe that even though they want to go by this way of we want less drastic movements, that would mean the world where those movements would have no power whatsoever, no influence as such, therefore no change would be happening, and those harms of globalization would be present. Three other things in my speech. First, being the mechanism and benefits. Second, about developing countries. And third, about populism as such. So let's take a look at the mechanism and benefits. What we provide you in today's debate was this idea that even though globalization can be beneficial in some way in terms of cooperation and those things, we need regulations, because without regulations, that would be those harms they acknowledge in the first place. Before I move, go ahead.
The anti-globalist movements are sure present, but they're only effective in destroying globalization and perpetuating problems, but not actually solving them. We are regretting that they're so present and so bad.
Thank you. I will talk to this later in this mechanism idea, because we've actually already told you what are those changes that we are bringing. But let's take a look back at those idea of regulations that are necessary right now. Because if you acknowledge that there are harms caused by globalization, and in your world they're not solved anyhow, you are losing today's debate, because you fail to provide this solution, and you can call it alternative or whatever you want to. We have those grassroots organizations or political parties, as we've already explained to you, and we believe that even if there was no solution, as you like to call it, we have this idea of pressure and threat. And this mechanism is very important, because when there are those politicians right now in power who are not anti-globalist, they know that there are people out there that would be threatening them if their policies would go against those workers in developing countries, if those policies would be against the most vulnerable people we have. Therefore, because they're aware of this pressure, they're aware of this threat, for example, because they see that there are protests organized by those movements, the policy-making process is influenced and the policy-making process is changed. Therefore, in our side, we are much more likely to get rid of those harms and have also the benefits globalization can provide. Second thing here is that we actually provide change. As you said that there is no change whatsoever, James already brought you the example that in Bangladesh, when there were those protests, minimum wage rise up. And we believe that even if we would win this debate only on this example, we provide you with change, we provide you with this solution for some problematics in developing countries. Therefore, we are much more likely to tackle those harms globalization has right now. And now finally about those benefits as such, where we were talking basically about long-term and short-term idea, where what we told you in our mechanism is that even if right now this rise of anti-globalist movements can mean that we have some shocks such as Brexit or such as US policy, we believe that in the long run, in terms of future, we have this mechanism that is very, very important, because we send this message to those MNCs, to those companies, and those people know that they cannot afford to exploit workers in developing countries, that they cannot afford to just profit from globalization but not really bring in benefits to other people and to our society as such. We believe that even though they are capable of presenting you some short-term disadvantages of Brexit, we have this long-term vision, because we believe that thanks to this, Britain has its sovereignty, and they can actually have their policy according to the needs of their citizens. And finally here, the idea of environment. When they say that, well, you have eco-terrorism and it's not helping anyhow, here we believe, no thank you, that it's not only about eco-terrorism. When you have anti-globalist movements, you have, for example, the environmentalists or the Greenpeace as such, and we've already brought you the examples how these movements are actually helpful and how these movements are bringing change. We believe that environment is also much more likely to be protected under our side of the house, because under their side of the house, those anti-globalist movements are less influential, therefore they do not have this pressure mechanism, and at the end of the day, they cannot really protect the environment as such, because as we've already explained to you through the mechanism of MNCs that are motivated by capitalist competition, they do not want to protect the environment in developing countries, because the only thing they see is the profit that there is. Thirdly, the developing countries, where their only reaction in their third speech was about infrastructure. The point here is that we have infrastructure from the harbor to the factory. You don't have local infrastructure that would connect cities that would be so very important for those local citizens. Therefore, no benefits for this society anyhow. And thirdly, here about the environment, as I've already explained to you in terms of benefits of our anti-globalist movements. We believe that local businesses are much more beneficial because they have this better incentive for local citizens as such. And finally, to populism, when we've explained to you that populism exists on both sides of the house, with the example of Bolsonaro, no reaction in their third. And we believe that because of the fact that anti-globalist movements are not only populist, but also influential individuals, as we brought you in our first speech, we believe that this is false characterization by side of proposition. For all those reasons, very proud to applaud.
Panel, the comparative is really simple. If we take their largest harms is that middle class, pretty rich people on a global scale in Britain will have a fluctuating exchange rate and will have more expensive products, that's the only harm they bring. But if you compare this to 783 million people in Southeast Asia, and this excludes India and China, remaining in extreme poverty, if you still have 16% of Bangladeshi workers working on zero contract hours, to the point at which when they cannot facilitate for the needs of their families, we tell you we bring far greater harms and therefore necessity for the action. The major strategic mistake on Team Croatia in today's debate is that they conceded to all the harms of globalization. So at this point, the debate becomes, can Team Czech Republic prove that we can solve these issues in a better way than them, or at least can we bring more benefits? So that's exactly what I'm going to be focusing on. First of all, having a look at developing countries. How do we solve the issue? What we brought already in LO and got very little traction is simply, when you have hundreds of thousands of people, as was the case in Bangladesh in 2016 and 2019, protesting in your capital city, irrespective of the fact if you pertain to a democratic system, you will feel pressure as a politician. Elena accentuated this in her whip speech when she said that you want to maintain your political position in whatever system you are. So what this means is, because you still want to keep that political position, you will satiate the demand of those people. Meaning when people are protesting because they don't have enough money when they work in sweatshops, what the Bangladeshi government did was that they increased the minimum wage, bringing palpable change towards those individuals. So what this shows is, because they are A, anti-establishment, they can provide pressure to the government, and second of all, because they can be on a wide political spectrum and therefore can actually get policies into parliament in this sense, we tell you we can provide change. But note, on team proposition, what happens without anti-global movements is that these MNCs have a far greater probability that they will still continue to extort these nations. Why? Because you don't have barriers that preclude them from doing so. Note that we live in a world where we do have anti-global movements that are already preventing them from doing these things to a certain degree, as we showed of the example of Bangladesh. But at the point at which, in a world where we don't have anti-global movements, then they can do whatever they want because we have very little traction. As Sasha was saying, with no opposition, right, the debate is won very easily. So what's happening is these people still stay entrenched in this poverty. Because they don't provide a solution, and because there's a massive harm on their side, we believe we should take the largest stakeholder of the developing countries in today's debate. Second, let's have a look at this issue of developed countries, where really their only issue is, whoa, people in Britain now have to pay not £1 for a Coke, but have to pay £3. Wow. So, first of all, what we were telling you is, even if this was true, and even if we took this complete harm, it does not outweigh the massive scale that we have for these developing countries, simply because A, these countries already, first of all, we were telling you that they were under a colonial rule and they deserve some redress in this sense. But second of all, we were telling you just on the sheer scale of the amount of people in which they are and what conditions they are subject to, they deserve this far more. Because these individuals already do have a strong market in the UK and can still survive this. But second of all, whether we're talking about populism right here in developed countries, Simply what we're saying is populism is very often just ingrained into the nature of people, where people do react to fear in a normal manner. I mean, we're telling this is absolutely a legitimate way of bringing political concern at the point at which when traditional politics don't work. And note that at the point at which when you do have those massive harms, then we need an extreme solution because the traditional ones have not worked. So we believe that populism is a legitimate means of solving this. Because of this, vote up.
The side of proposition, it's truly disgusting that the side of the opposition is really happy with the crumbles they're getting on their side. That they're truly proud with the world they have created with the anti-globalist movements, actually making a worst case scenario from the world, worst case scenarios that is on their current side. So let's actually take it from the start, let's take it to the comparative. First of all, let me tell you, dear panel, unfortunately for the side of opposition, we actually actively call out op blocks. We are telling you that their mechanisms only came out in the third speech and in the reply. Their mechanism of pressure, how the pressure changes something, how the politicians want to stay in power, came too late for us to even respond in the debate. So first of all, we are telling you that just to call it out so it wouldn't be missed. So now let's start from the start, let's take it into a comparative and see what is their best case scenario. Their best case scenarios, what they literally tell us is we're talking about it. Okay, first of all, we are telling you they never showed us how talking actually changes things, only in their whip and reply speech. They're never telling us how that pressure of talking will actually change anything. What we're doing is that we're telling you that first of all, that problem is being ignored. Because now we're living as people on a presumption that if I fill in a poll on Facebook from Green Life, that I'm actually changing anything, which is not currently happening. That is the first thing. Second of all, we are telling you that this is something that is changing only eventually marginally. We're telling you that in these third world countries, nothing is really changing. 1 cent up, this is still a really big problem that the side of opposition finds disgusting that the side of opposition thinks they have solved. We're telling you that the side of opposition, their anti-globalist movements, has such a big space to actually maneuver and become a great movement, but what they're doing is completely inefficient. They're pinpointing the wrong problems. In developing nations, it's not the factories exploiting workers, they're giving them jobs. It's the actual states that are letting this happen. We have showed you that through our speeches, never telling us on their side how they're actually changing the structure of the countries, because we can still see that people are in poverty. People don't get that much higher pays, and people are not in a good position, never rebutted by their side. This is like their best case scenario. What is their worst case scenario? We have Trump, we have Brexit, we have the China having their Belt and Road Initiative, never really rebutted by the side of the opposition. They're telling us, oh well, then what is that, why is that so really bad? First of all, we're telling you about Trump. He is populistic. The reason why people voted for him is because he is a populist. He came to power. What did he do then? First of all, what we can see is that in America, he pinpointed the problem. Yes, immigrants are the problem. But what he did is pinpointed to the whole of the globalization. We're telling you that the populists are taking a problem and they're spinning it on the wrong side, and they're making it bigger than it is, and they're generalizing it and offering a simple solution that couldn't be solved just that simply. We're telling you that the violence, first of all, to minorities in the USA has never been bigger. They told in our second speech, never rebutted by their side. He is actually perpetuating and pinning it on the minorities, which is not their fault. Second of all, we're telling you how he is not solving the problem. He said, well, immigrants are a problem, and that's why he closed the whole borders. This is why the dollar is currently falling on the market. This is why nobody wants to currently trade with the USA anymore, because they have closed borders, because they're not stable anymore, and because they're not globalist anymore. This is what we're telling you, and people in USA are not now living prosperously. We can see that the people in USA are not happy with the things that have happened. Dear panel, let me remind you of that. Second of all, Brexit. They have told us, oh, sovereignty of people. But what we have seen, because of the sovereignty of people, first of all, they don't have medicine. They're really sad because the pound is dropping. They have more expensive products, and they have nothing good on their side. We're telling you that the people they're telling us that they're getting their will are unhappy on their side. People in developing countries still working for peanuts, still having no rights. Nothing is changing on the side of the opposition. And also they're telling us with talking, we're going to influence the biggest players in the game. How are you going to influence by Facebook? How are you going to influence like the most of the richest people in the world that are currently holding the whole economy? This is not something that can just influence as much. And we're telling you that the anti-globalist movements should unite over the world. What the side of proposition is telling you, we would much rather, even if they tell that we must completely disregard the anti-globalist movements, we would much rather not have them at all than to have them being so detrimental to everything and all the benefits. This is why Trump wins.